Russian troops are advancing in Ukraine at fastest pace since the early days of the war in February 2022, Reuters reported on Tuesday. Russia has set new weekly and monthly records for the size of the occupied territory in Ukraine, independent Russian news group Agentstvo said. According to the report, Russia has captured almost 235 square kilometers in Ukraine over the past week alone, a weekly record for 2024. Russian forces had captured 600 square kilometers in November, it added, citing data from DeepState that has links to the Ukrainian army. It should be noted that Moscow controls 18% of Ukraine, including all of Crimea Peninsula that it annexed in 2014, just over 80% of eastern Donbas region and more than 70% of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions in the south, according to open-source maps. Russia has pledged to achieve all of its military objectives despite what Ukraine's Western allies say or do. However, Kremlin has not spelled out its objectives in Ukraine in details. Last week Russia used a hypersonic intermediate-range missile on Ukraine for the first time. The move came after Ukraine struck Russian territory with Western-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadow long-range missiles. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have completed the clearing of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region from Russian occupation forces. The Ukrainian analytical project DeepState reported this on its Telegram channel. They updated their map of military operations. According to the analysts, the invading army of the Russian Federation has made new advances on the front. The enemy advanced near Novomlinsk, Dalny, Konstantinopolsky, as well as in Razdolnoy and Kurakovo. Let us recall that on November 13, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported an attempt by Russian invaders to break through the Ukrainian defense near the city. It was stated that the Ukrainian defenders repelled 4 waves of assaults. Some of the occupiers were dressed in uniforms similar to those of the Ukrainian armed forces. DeepState wrote then that one transporter was shot down in the forest, and the second was hit in the area of Nekrasov Street. 12.5 of the invaders ran out of it and scattered to local houses. Ukrainian fighters also shot down a tank and destroyed part of the enemy landing force. Analysts reported that the Russian command sent reinforcements, but the Ukrainian defenders defeated them as well. DeepState says that Russian army has advanced in Kurakovo, Razdolnoy and Petrovka, as well as near Novomlinsk, Dalny, Konstantinopolsk. The enemy advanced near Novomlinsk, Dalny, Konstantinopolsk, as well as in Razdolnoy and Kurakovo, the report says. In the 24 hours from November 25 to November 26, the Russian army lost 1,480 soldiers, 72 UAVs operational tactical level, and 20 armored personnel vehicles on the front lines, according to data from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. During the plenary session of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, a resolution was adopted calling on NATO member countries to support Ukraine in its efforts to achieve full membership as soon as possible, according to the text of the resolution. The Assembly urges member governments and parliaments of the North Atlantic Alliance to step up political and practical efforts to help Ukraine receive an invitation and become the 33rd member of NATO as soon as possible, the document states. The authors of the resolution emphasized the importance of strengthening military, financial, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, including the timely delivery of ammunition and modern weapon systems. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly recommended that the governments of the member countries of the alliance provide Ukraine with medium-range missiles for deterrence and self-defense. People's Deputy from the Servant of the People faction and head of the permanent delegation of Ukraine to the NATO PA Yair Chernev said this. RBC Ukraine reports with reference to his post on Facebook. According to him, we are talking about ballistic missiles with a range of 1,000 to 5,500 kilometers, in particular, such as Tomahawks, which are capable of striking the strategic depth of the enemy. The Ukrainian delegation managed to convince Western colleagues to support my proposal and include this item in the resolution of the next session of the Assembly, he said. According to the deputy, the adopted resolution is the first step that creates a legal basis for the further decision of the governments of the NATO countries to transfer the relevant weapons to Ukraine. Chernov also recalled that at the previous session, on the initiative of the Ukrainian delegation, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly called to allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory, raising this issue to a political level. We hope for a positive decision this time as well, the People's Deputy concluded. Tomahawk is a family of long-range American multi-purpose cruise missiles designed for strategic and tactical missions. The missiles are capable of operating from underwater, surface, land and air platforms. The flight of the rocket is carried out at extremely low altitudes with the possibility of bypassing the topography of the area. They are in service on ships and submarines of the U.S. Navy and have been used in all major military operations involving the U.S. since they entered service in 1983. As of 2014, the estimated cost of one rocket was $1.45 million. Recently, the head of the Pentagon, Lloyd Austin, said that the Russians have moved their tactical aviation beyond the range of ATACMS missiles transferred to the armed forces. At the same time, Defense Minister Rustem Umerov explained that Ukraine handed the U.S. a list of targets for ATACMS deep strikes on Russia.
Russian losses in November are on track to be record-breaking in 3 categories: manpower, infantry armor, and motor vehicles. This gives an idea of what Russian tactics are like at the front today, Ukrainian military observer Alexander Kovalenko said. Thus, the absolute record in personnel losses, which is clearly looming by the end of the month, according to Kovalenko, confirms the growing shortage of military equipment, which is why the Russians have to rely more on manpower. The analyst believes that in 2025, the Russian army will actively switch to the format of March battalions, i.e., hastily formed from fresh reinforcements. Kovalenko explains the high losses in infantry armored vehicles by the obvious haste of the Russians in their attempts to capture as much Ukrainian territory as possible. At the same time, the increase in losses in cars is a manifestation of the Russian practice of using civilian vehicles in battles, which in turn further fuels the growth of personnel losses. Kovalenko notes, it is difficult to obtain concrete information about Russian casualties, which comprise deaths and injuries. Moscow has an incentive to minimize its losses and rarely discloses any information. Ukraine and its allies have an incentive to overstate them. Even if they are accurate, the Western casualty estimates usually lump together deaths with all injuries. Military experts say that category is too broad to fully explain the state of the war. Likely wounded soldiers can quickly recover, for example. What determines a military's true ability to fight are its irreplaceable, irrecoverable, or permanent losses. Soldiers who are dead or so seriously injured that they will never see battle again. Russia and Ukraine treat such statistics as state secrets. Ukraine guards its casualty figures especially closely, restricting journalists' ability to report on the topic, withholding information from allies, and halting the publication of demographic data. Some independent Russian journalists and researchers have found innovative ways to count Russia's dead and wounded, digging up information from diverse sources like obituaries, cemeteries, disability payments, and notary databases. Their calculations begin to show a more accurate toll of the war, shedding light on Russia's ability to continue the fight. They also suggest that Russia has lost more soldiers in this war than any industrialized nation has in the conflict since World War II. After estimating the number of dead Russian soldiers, journalists from the BBC, Mediazona, and Meduza collaborated on the next task: quantifying Russia's severe battlefield injuries. They consulted military experts, analyzed leaked personnel lists, and looked at statistics on veterans' compensation payments. They concluded that for every dead Russian soldier, about 2 more were seriously injured. The military intelligence agencies of Ukraine and many NATO nations produce their own estimates of Russian casualties. They all claim that Russia has lost 600,000 to 700,000 in dead and wounded soldiers as of October.